You may or may not know that Satanism is actually a formally organized religion, and it has been for quite some time. They even have a motto. The motto is, "Do what thou wilt." And so, like most things from Satan, it sounds pretty good on the surface, right? Do whatever you want. But, like all things from Satan, there's a much more pernicious and heavier cost that's hidden under the covers here. So let's dig into this, because at the end of this presentation, I think you'll be quite surprised to recognize just how many ideas or organizations today adopt this motto. But in order to get there, we need to understand a little bit more what this is all about and why it's wrong. In the garden, Satan tempted Eve. God said, "Don't eat of the tree of knowledge." And Satan said, "Well, if you eat it, you'll become like God, and you won't surely die." God said, "The penalty is death." Satan said, "Nah, no it isn't." In other words, do whatever you want. Here's the problem with doing whatever you want. While it's true that you should think about what you want, and you should go for what you want, you don't get to decide the laws of cause and effect. Now, pretty much everything I just said, you're not going to hear in any church today, for reasons we'll get to. Modern churches teach that desire is bad. It's something you have to fight. It's something you have to set aside as a Christian. Well, good luck doing that. You're never going to find somebody who's done it. Why? Because it's part of what we're designed with. It is actually a tremendous gift from God. You can cut it out of yourself only by making yourself less like God. He has desires. Desire is not a four-letter word. What you choose to attempt to fill your desire with, that can and often is bad. But it doesn't need to be. You can desire whatever you want. The problem comes when we dissociate what fulfills your desire, the object, we'll say the object of your desire, when we dissociate the object of your desire from what fulfills it, from the path to get there. When we pretend that these things are not already coupled, and that we fail to acknowledge that we don't get to decide that pairing. If you want a surefire way to kill temptation in your life, temptation to sin, here it is. Find out the cost and benefit of what you desire, the true cost and the true benefit, and what other options exist. You see, every choice you make, it doesn't exist in isolation. No choice you make exists in isolation. Every choice you make is connected to everything else. You can't choose something without choosing to not have something else. Every choice is an exchange. At a minimum, it's the exchange of what you could have had for what you do have. And so you have to understand the interconnected nature of reality. And as you understand more of that, the power of temptation over you will drop like a stone. But the first step is understanding that these laws of cause and effect, they're not yours. You don't get to change them. You only get to choose which one you will prefer. And that's a good way of putting it, because many times they are mutually exclusive. And so you have to have a ranking. What do you want the most? And wanting it the most means that you're willing to pursue it even if it costs you everything else. And when you take that tack, you will find that the power of temptation over you, it recedes rapidly. Here is the truth. Outcomes are inseparably coupled to what produces them. And you can't decide that. You can discover it and you can choose between options, but you can't change that coupling. It was set by God before the world was created. And of course, Satan's not going to tell you that, right? He's going to do everything he can to hide that or to minimize it. To obtain an outcome, you must follow the law that produces it. That's the end of the story. You can't separate the outcome from the cause. You also can't separate the consequences. That's part of the cost, right? It's not just what you have to pay up front. It's what you're going to have to pay later. It's all connected. D&C 30, verses 20 and 21 read, "There is a law irrevocably decreed in heaven before the foundations of this world, upon which all blessings are predicated. And when we obtain any blessing from God, it is by obedience to that law upon which it is predicated. It's also true that any undesired outcome also comes from that same law. They're one and the same. This is one of the things that the Book of Mormon teaches very clearly, that in order to have blessing, you also have to have punishment. The law affixes both. It creates both. D&C 132:5 says something similar, "For all who have a blessing at my hand shall abide the law which was appointed for that blessing, and the conditions thereof as were instituted from before the foundation of the world." What we do instead of following this is that we tend to think of the outcomes as dissociated from the path to get them. We don't realize that the default condition is that you will desire, if you desire an outcome, you're not going to desire the path to it. And if you like the path to something, you're probably not going to like where it takes you. This is part of the opposition in all things in life. Now, there's a solution to this. It's called faith. Faith is what reconciles our tendency to desire either the outcome or the path to get it. When you have faith, what you do is you attribute the value of the outcome you desire to the path that obtains it. So, let's say that you really want a bike and it costs a certain amount of money. What you want is the bike. You don't want the job that you have to work to get the money to buy the bike. But if you know that that's the path to get the bike, you can find meaning in the job that overcomes the how monotonous you find it or how boring you find it or annoying. But it's faith that transfers that value that you associate with the outcome to the path to get it. Now that's not all faith is, but it's a great thing to think about in this context. And so, of course, Satan isn't going to present to you a path that highlights the fact that everything is governed by God's laws of cause and effect. He's not going to teach you about faith. He doesn't want you to think about the path to outcomes. He just wants to shine the outcome in front of your face. Or just the path. He chooses one or the other, but not both. So if you follow the shiny path, you'll get to outcomes that you don't want. And if you're attracted to the outcome without thinking of the path, you're never going to get it because that path is going to be very undesirable. It's only through faith that you can couple these things together. You can discover the path to what you want and find the strength to traverse it as given. So understanding the problem with do what thou wilt and what it really means, which is you can have anything you want separate from the price God has ordained to get it. Now we can look in our modern world and find the many places where this motto is subscribed to, the many ideas that are instances of it. And if you have any others, I invite you to write them into the comments on YouTube. Here's one, minimum wage. How is that an example of do what thou wilt? Well, it's an outcome divorced from anything around it. It's completely arbitrary. People should make a certain amount at a minimum. Why? Because it makes us feel good. Because we think they should. It's completely divorced from the rules of economics, which are not arbitrary things. They're part of the fabric of reality. If you force a person to get paid something at a minimum, what you're doing is choosing, this is the hidden cost, you're choosing to make them unemployable if they're not worth that much. What about everybody should go to college? Everybody should go to college, independent of how intelligent they are, what other options they might have, what other options might exist, what they study, how hard they work at it, or what it costs. Do you see the problem? Do you see how it's divorced from the surrounding details? Well, it's terrible advice. No surprise. What about we are all equal? Says who? According to what? According to what measure are we all equal? You see, it's completely separated from the surrounding details. There's no law of cause and effect here. It's just by fiat declaration, we are all equal. Well, what about all these differences I see? Oh, just ignore them. Just ignore them. They don't matter. Prove it. Well, there is no proof. And here's the thing, and here's the pattern you should see. When you willingly ignore the details that are obvious, on the front end of this equation, they will reappear on the back end of the equation. And they will be worse on the back end of the equation. If you ignore the differences that are apparent and you declare we are all equal in spite of the differences, guess what's going to happen? Those differences will get worse and the effect of them will get worse because you're trying to sweep it under the rug instead of recognizing it up front. Same thing with minimum wage. Well, I feel like people should make more money. Great. I do too. So can we encourage them to do the things that are already established that increase your value? Or are you just going to skip over that and try to force the issue? And then lo and behold, it just gets worse. What about diversity is our strength? How is it our strength? Show me data that proves that. First off, define the word diversity. What do you mean? Because you don't actually mean what that word means. Your definition is much more narrow. If you're saying this, what you really mean isn't the word diversity. It's a subset of that. And now prove to me that it actually makes things better. How? What's the law of cause and effect here? And so you'll see multiple layers of distortion. And what comes out the tail end is worse. Rich people should pay their fair share. How's that divorced from the law of cause and effect? Again, define all the words. What do you mean by rich people? What do you mean by fair share? What do you mean by should? How are you going to enforce it? Who gets to decide what fair means? And now, what are the effects of this? What are the hidden effects? If you implement minimum wage, one of the unintended consequences, there are many, one is that everything becomes more expensive. Do you know who's disproportionately harmed every single time minimum wage is implemented or raised? The poorest people. Look up the studies. There is no counterexample. It is universal. Same thing with rich people should pay their fair share. Well, what happens when they do? Define all those words. What hidden laws of cause and effect are you invoking that cause the opposite of what you say you want? Okay, here's one that might surprise you. Almost every religious person, every professed Christian, I'll be specific, almost every professed Christian believes in salvation outside of similitude to Christ. There are two primary forms of this. One is that some profession of what they believe, which itself redefines the word belief, because scripturally, you can't believe something separate to your actions or desires. But in modern Christianity, you can. So whatever they mean by belief, that their professed belief is what salvation consists in or is determined by. Well, that is a completely made up law of cause and effect. And no surprise, the effects of that are not what you read in the scriptures. They're completely different. The people who follow that are completely devoid of all of the outcomes described in the scriptures. And it's no different for those who practice another form of salvation outside of similitude to Christ, which is to believe that the practice of some set of religious rites is what qualifies someone for salvation. So something like baptism by your church, or participating in communion, or whatever variant you might have of that, or participating in other religious ceremonies. Well, that's salvation outside of similitude to Christ. It's some other thing. It's some other law of cause and effect. And guess what? It doesn't produce the promised fruit. It's a version of do what thou wilt. Those religious people subscribe to religion because it gives them an excuse to do something other than what Jesus would do in their place and not feel guilty about it. Well, that's contrary to the law established before the foundation of the world. To be a follower of Christ means that you actually have to do what he would do in your place, at least as far as you understand it, which is a key portion of that. So, again, if you can think of other examples of this, please put them in the comments. This is the belief that the Babylonian system is founded on. Do whatever you want, and you'll find it in surprising places.